Let me begin by saying that it's a pleasure to be back at the Festival of Bharat. I was here in the last round, and I believe I'm at least told that that particular recording has got some 15,000 hits or something like that. So I was particularly pleased with that. But I've chosen a very different topic this time to speak about, which is to give you some sense of the political economic thought in India over the last several millennia. Now, obviously, people like myself went through the Indian education system. I'm a professional economist. I have a degree in economics from Delhi University, one of the country's premier institutions. But we are taught almost nothing about our own political and economic thought in our curriculums. Not in school, not in university, maybe a few specialists in doing a PhD in the subject may ever get to learn something about Indian political and economic thought. But by and large, we are left learning ideas brought in from the rest of the world. This is not to say that the ideas from the rest of the world are not important, but I think it is important to also go back and look at many of the interesting thoughts that are contained in our own texts. So I'm going to take you through a brief journey of some of the ideas and thoughts and debates that Indian political and economic thought has had over the millennia. Now, one of the starting ideas of foundational ideas of Indian political and economic thought is the idea of Matsya Nyaya. Now, what is Matsya Nyaya? Matsya Nyaya is the idea of the law of the fish, where the big fish eat the small fish. So, it's not too different in some ways from the idea of the law of the jungle that is commonly used in the West. There are minor differences, but broadly the idea is that the powerful will dominate the less powerful in arbitrary use of violence and force, not just physical violence and force, but other kinds of pressure, unless there is some form of a state that protects the poor and imposes rule of law. Now, this is a very, very foundational idea of Indian political thought. Again, those of you who are familiar with Western thought, you will see that this has echoes with ideas from Locke and Hobbes and so on, who were also talking about that without the state, without rule of law, life was short and brutish. And so this is where Indian political thought also starts off all those thousands of years back. Now, many of our texts then hint at what should be done. So whether it's the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, and of course very famously Kautilya's Arthashastra or Kamandak's Nitisara and so on, then talk about what is the nature of the state, why do we need a state, what is it that a good king should do or not do, and so on and so forth. And you see that coming through right in the beginning in our epics. So you have, for example, the Ramayana. Now, of course, both the Ramayana and Mahabharata have specific sections. For example, where Bhishma, lying on the bed of arrows, tells Yudhishthir about how a good government or the state or a king should behave in order to be in accordance with dharma. Now, I'm not even going to go into the specifics of that. I'm going to talk about the wider ideas that are there in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Now, the Ramayana starts out right in the beginning, originally as a very simple story of love and adventure. This is in some ways not too different from the story that pretty much every Indian grandmother tells her grandchildren at bedtime. This is a simple story. It is common throughout not just India, but outside of India as well. And this somehow at some point in time gets formalized into the Sanskrit epic of Valmiki. But the epic of Valmiki that we have now inherited is not the original Valmiki's Ramayana. What happened is that some point along the way, a large number of interpolations were added. In particular, a large section in the end, which we now know as the Uttar Ramayana, and some sections in between, and particularly in the very beginning, which in fact turned Valmiki, first of all, into a contemporary of Ram, which wasn't quite the case in the original version. But what it also does is it turns the Ramayana into a discussion about the rule of law. So what is Ram trying to do? So the original story of love and adventure is converted into a story about the rule of law. And why is Ram the Purushottam, the great man, why is Ram the great king? And incidentally, in the Ramayana, he's not quite yet Bhagwan Ram. That happens much later in Tulsi and so on. So in the beginning, he is the great man, the great hero, the great king Ram. And why is he a great king? Why is he a great man? Because he believes in the law and follows it. So throughout the Ramayana, what is Ram doing? He follows the law. Even when the law is against him, when it is unfair, he follows the law. So it is entirely unfair that he is sent to exile. But that was what his father had promised. So the contract or the promise has to be enforced. So this is a very important thing. So throughout the story, you see, he keeps doing that. And now, while that was just there in the original version as an episode, by the end, that becomes a dominant theme. And an entire section, the Uttar Ramayana, is added to make this case, where he, as the king, has to send his wife away to exile, even though he agrees that it is unfair. It is not that the Ramayana justifies Sita's second exile. And Ram himself does not justify it. He agrees it is unfair. He does not remarry. He, in fact, pines for her for the rest of his life. But as the king, he has to follow the law, even when it is unfair. So this is what comes down to, what is Ram Rajya? Now, Ram Rajya is not the kingdom of God. It is not heaven, it is not paradise, it is not perfect. The Indian conception of Ram Rajya as the ideal state is one where the ruler himself applies the law to himself. That is Ram Rajya, i.e. a place where there is rule of law right through the whole system. So this is a very important thing to understand about the Ramayana. The Ramayana has converts by the end as an argument for the absolute rule of law. Now, interestingly, those who were kind of fiddling around with Valmiki's Ramayana and expanding it were aware that at some future date there would be these postmodernist readers who would try to convert this into some sort of an argument about patriarchy and feminism. So they also inserted in there the story of Ahilya. And what is the story of Ahilya? The story of Ahilya is that there is Ahilya who, by mistake, without knowing, ended up sleeping with a man who was not her husband, and is cursed to become a stone, and Ram comes and actually reconverts her back to a woman. So the point being made is that this was not about some idea of purity. So Ram was not worked up about the fact that Sita had spent so much time, had to go away. It is not about her chastity that he was worried. That was the law, and he had to follow it. He was fully aware of this. In fact, going through the Agni Pariksha process itself, Sita at that point in time, he and Ram have a conversation about this. So this whole episode has to be seen then as a conversion of the document into an argument, and a very strict argument for the rule of law, irrespective of whether or not the laws themselves are fair or not. Now, what is interesting is that not everybody in ancient India agreed with this interpretation, severe interpretation of the rule of law. And so that's where the Mahabharata comes in. Now, what is interesting about the Mahabharata is that in the Mahabharata, the so-called villains, and of course, the Mahabharata is about shades of grey. I'm using the term villain in a very loose sense, but nevertheless, the villains, the Kauravas, they actually follow the law. So interestingly, in the Mahabharata, the Kauravas technically always follow the law. It is the Pandavas who keep breaking the law. Even Yudhishthir, the Dharma Raja, also breaks the law at one point in time at least. But the Kauravas follow the law. And yet, they are continuously using the law against natural justice. So in the Ramayana, natural justice is not the issue. The issue is rule of law. Those who are within the rule of law are in Ram Rajya. Those who are outside the rule of law are outside Ram Rajya, or in fact outside civilization, and consequently they are in state of being the laws of the jungle, and consequently when dealing with them you don't have to follow the rule of law. And incidentally, in the Ramayana, the killing of Bali is specifically inserted and termed in this particular way to show that to show the difference between those within the rule of law and those without. So even Ram, when he is dealing with those who are outside the rule of law, does not follow the rule of law. So that is the other interesting thing. But here in the Ramayana, in the Mahabharata, you find there are these people who follow the rule of law but are using it for bad things. So technically, having won Draupadi in the game of dice, the Kauravas owned her and could pretty much do whatever they wanted with her. So dragging her to the darbar and attempting to strip her was legally okay because they owned her. Now, this is where Krishna comes in. And Krishna follows the law. He's never stopping them from trying to strip her. All he does is make it impossible to do so by making her sari being infinitely long. Now, the same thing happens with the Kurukshetra War as well. Arjun says that I, having failed to kill the killer of my son, will now kill myself on a funeral pyre at dusk. And so he's going to go and basically he's walking towards the funeral pyre because he has failed to kill the killer of his son, as he had promised. So he's walking there, and then suddenly Krishna removes the clouds and the sun shines through all of a sudden. And so the sun, it is not yet sunset, and Arjun lifts his bow suddenly and takes revenge. Now look at here how Krishna is different from Ram. Krishna is twisting the law to serve a sense of natural justice. So again, you can see that there are these two strains of thought, natural justice and a strict rule of law. And this debate is going on between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and both these texts are being slowly changed in various ways in order to allow this debate to happen. Now, what is interesting is that it is a debate that is not concluded. It is not the case that the Ramayana says we are better than the Mahabharata and vice versa. These are two cases that are made and left to the reader to understand the dynamics of this debate. And in fact, in order to stop this becoming some sort of a sectarian debate, what is interesting, the ancients made sure that this debate is carried out between two avatars of the same God, so that people understand that this is not some sort of a great, ideological divide. This is a much more nuanced debate between two ways of looking at things. Now I'm going to take you to think about another debate that happened in very ancient times. This is the debate that happened in the very first large empire that Indians built, the Mauryan Empire. And of course, as you know, the Mauryan Empire was built by Chanakya, who, as his pen name being Kautilya, and he of course created this book called the Arthashastra. Arthashastra literally means the treatise on national wealth or on wealth. So it was, thousands of years before Adam Smith, and the name is not so different. Adam Smith, as you know, wrote The Wealth of Nations. So in that sense, this is a precursor. Now, in the Arthashastra, there obviously, it's like a manual. Those of you who have read it will know. And it has all kinds of things about how to build roads and how to build cities. And incidentally, those who have not read it tend to come to the conclusion that it's all about spies and so on. It's not. It's a fairly comprehensive book on all kinds of things, from taxation and what to do about prohibition or not to have prohibition, how to regulate gambling dens. All kinds of things are there. And there are also a little bits and pieces on spies and the foreign policy and the mandala theory and so on. But frankly, these are all different chapters. If you look at it as an entirety, it's a very, very fascinating document about how to run an empire by a man who created one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Now, Chanakya is quite interesting because never mind the specific details of the rules and regulations he created. Obviously, he was creating rules and regulation for his time. So he has traffic rules for bullock carts, which may no longer be quite the same thing. I mean, we obviously need to not care about them. We have to modernize those things. But there are some interesting principles in Chanakya that are quite interesting. Now, what Chanakya does is he argues for a strong but limited state. Now, this requires some explaining. So, in the epics, the debate is about rule of law and natural justice as a way of holding back Matsya Nyaya. Here we have a document which talks about the role of the state much more clearly and about actually running an empire and how that should be used, the role of the state in essentially controlling the problem of Matsya Nyaya. And Matsya Nyaya, therefore, and he talks about the role of the state then in doing a bunch of things. So he's very clear, the most important role of the state are the following. It is defense, external defense. It is internal law and order and internal security. The delivery of justice, very, very important. And then there are a whole bunch of regulatory things that he puts in. He's very clear that, for example, he talks about prohibition and even about prostitution, about the regulation of these sectors. And it's quite interesting. He actually specifically says the prohibition is a bad idea, that bads should be regulated, not banned. So it's quite interesting. But what is interesting in all of this is throughout this whole thing, while he's talking about what the state should do, he continuously keeps repeating that the king must be restrained, i.e. the state must be restrained. He goes on and on about this, and it's there throughout it. Now, why is he so obsessed about limiting the state? Now, this is not because he is a libertarian. Chanakya is not a libertarian. He's not talking about a minimal state at all. Be under no doubt about this. Those things that Chanakya believes the state should do, he has no sense of humor. He talks about a strong but limited state. But remember, the strong bit is pretty important. And so things that the state should be doing, for example, internal security, he has no sense of humor about how the state should go about it. But he, at the same time, wants to limit the state. Now, why does he do this? Now, in the Western conception of limiting the state, which, ultimately, at its extreme becomes a libertarian dream of a minimal state, the idea comes from ideas of freedom against the powers of the state. So this is where Western thought came from. So if you read the Magna Carta, for example, the Magna Carta is about the aristocracy, the noblemen, getting their freedoms protected from the powers of the king. Later on, you have ideas coming with Locke and in the Enlightenment in Europe. The ideas is about the innate rights of man against the state or the church, both of which, through the medieval and late medieval period, had enormous power on people's lives. So much of Western thought is basically about trying to protect the individual against the intrusiveness of the state, both from the political state as well as the religious state. So that is how their political thought evolved. So it's about freedom. The state is limited because of reasons of freedom. But when you come to Chanakya, the reasons for limiting the state are actually quite fundamentally different, and in some ways very, very Indian. The first reason for limiting the state is a pretty obvious one, and a very practical one, which he says that if the state is too weak, then nobody will care, and there will be Matsya Nyaya, because nobody will listen to you. But on the other hand, if you tighten it too much, you will end up with people being too rebellious because you're suffocating them too much. So this is a very practical reason why he says the state must be restrained. Then there is another reason, which is a very Indian reason in some ways, which he says the reason the state has to be limited is because government officials are inherently corrupt. And so he has this very much quoted comment, which he says is that just like when a fish is swimming in water, and you cannot tell how much water it is drinking while it is swimming, in the same way, you cannot tell how much money a government servant is skimming while working in the government. In other words, the point he's making is a government servant is inherently corrupt or corruptible, and you should never trust them. And so, therefore, you must always restrain the state because these fellows are highly suspect all the time. So this is not reasons of freedom, but reasons of misuse of power and corruption that he wants to limit the state. So this is a very different way of thinking about limiting the state. It is not the libertarian case for limiting the state. It is a very different case for limiting the state. Now, what is interesting here is that there are other visions of the state that exist at the same time. And they come to fruition just 2 generations later with Ashoka. So Chanakya builds this great empire along with Chandragupta, and Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, has a very different conception of what the state should be. So much is made about Ashoka's edicts on his so-called pacifism, of which I have my suspicions, but that's a different debate. But let's look at his conception of the state. If you read Ashoka's edicts, Ashoka basically repeatedly says, I am the parent, the father to my people. He says, just like a mother gives her child to a nurse for looking after, in the same way I have given my people to my officials to look after. Now this is a clear violation of Chanakyan, Kautilyan views of what officials should be doing. Then he talks about, my people will be looked after by the Dharma Mahamantas. Now Kautilya would have interpreted this as religious police. So, very, very different conception. Then look at Ashoka. What does he say about the specific things he tells people to do? He says, you will not sell fish or eat meat on so-and-so day of Chaturmasi and so-and-so day of Tissa. He says, you should not castrate a bull or a goat on the so-and-so day of Chaturmasi, on so-and-so day of Tissa, and so on. As if the bull really cared about whether or not it got castrated on Monday or Tuesday. So this is the kind of very much more intrusive worldview, where the state is not seen with suspicion, but as seen as a Mai Baap Sarkar, that there's something inherently benevolent about the state, and that anything the state does must necessarily be a good thing for the people, because the king thinks so. You can clearly see a clear difference between the two worldviews. Again, the point I'm making to you is, I'm trying to give you a sense of the kinds of political thoughts and debates that are happening from very, very ancient times. And by the way, these are not the only names. I've just given you a few examples. There are some great other writers. Chanakya himself mentions the different schools. There is the schools of Brihaspati, and there is the school of Shukra. And they are very different schools. And it is interesting here in this context, the Brihaspati is, of course, the school of Brihaspati. The Brihaspati is the guru of the Devas. And there is the school of Shukra, the guru of the Asuras. And in ancient times, this dichotomy of them being, one group being the gods and the other being the demons, didn't exist. They didn't exist in Vedic thought at all. They were two different ways of thinking about the world. So the Asuric line of thought was just given as much respect. It was just a different way of thinking. And it was a much more legalistic thinking. It was much more about dandaniti, a much more severe approach to the state. And the Brihaspati's view was a little more about, I wouldn't call welfareist, but certainly not so legalist. And so there were other schools of thought, and even after Chanakya and Ashoka and so on, you have other thinkers. For example, during the Gupta period, you have Kamandak and the Nitisara, where again he debates. And by the way, all of these people quote those who came before them. So it's not like they were writing in isolation. Each one of them was aware of the existing schools, about the schools that existed before them, and many of them then provide they quote them and talk about these earlier schools of thought, give their comments, I agree here, I disagree here, and so on, which is quite fascinating because in some ways this is very similar to how modern research is done, and was miles ahead of how research was done in the rest of the world in those days. So you can see not only was there political thought and debate, but long periods of continuity in these thoughts up to modern times, where we have almost lost the continuity of this thought. But my idea here was to give you some sense of these debates. I, of course, have my own preferences about which of these schools I prefer. The fact of the matter is, my own view is, if you think about it, Kautilya created the great Mauryan Empire, and during the time of Ashoka, that empire collapsed. The empire of Chandragupta collapsed during his grandson's time while he was still alive, while Ashoka was still alive. It's not that something had happened after him. So I would argue I have far more sympathy for the creator of the empire rather than its destroyer. Thank you very much.